open thinking, okay? I've got two aims in giving this speech tonight. The first of them is connected with Holocaust Memorial Day, which was last Monday, and the second of them is connected with a speech about the Holocaust that those of us who were at the last meeting of the club before Christmas were shown in recorded form, and it was presented as an exemplar speech. Now, in this speech, a Toastmaster colleague from another club gave an account of her visit to the concentration camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And during the course of her speech, she very, very vividly put across the distress and the anger that she felt at various points throughout that visit. Indeed, she did it so vividly that she actually became angry and became distressed, or at any rate appeared to, on a number of occasions during that speech. To the extent that in the general discussion that we had afterwards, a number of people felt that she'd nearly lost it, that was the expression used, lost it, at a number of points during the speech. And it was also generally felt that this was a strength of the speech because it increased the impact. Now, I've got a very particular problem with that view. I really don't agree with it. Don't say it's wrong, but I have another way of looking at that. And I don't think that the speaker actually achieved the aims that I suspect she was setting out to. And so I want to explore that a little tonight by talking about a similar topic. Not a visit to a concentration camp. I, like many of you perhaps, have visited Auschwitz, and for want of a much better expression, its sister camp, Majdanek, near Lublin in Poland. But members will recall that about a year ago, we had a very fine speech from one of our members, Keith Sexton, about his visit to Auschwitz. And there's really nothing I could add to what Keith gave us on that occasion. I want instead to talk about a visit I made when I was in Lublin, not that Majdanek visit, when I was in Lublin, to what's called there the new Jewish cemetery. It's not actually all that new, it dates back to the 19th century. Now, Lublin is a quite large city in southeastern Poland, and for about 300 years, it was the absolute centre of Jewish intellectual, cultural, and religious life. Not just for Poland, but for Europe as a whole. And it boasted a highly sophisticated Jewish community of tens of thousands at the start of the Second World War in 1939. When I last visited in 2014, I made inquiries about the size of the Jewish community at that time, and I found that it was 37. And the Lublin ghetto was liquidated, to use the anodyne term that the SS coined, in 1942. So what I would like to do, just for a few minutes, is take you with me on the visit that I paid to the new Jewish cemetery in Lublin on a boiling hot June day in 2014. The sun is so bright that the sky is white rather than blue. It's really quite an uncomfortable day. And we're heading out on a road that leads directly out of the city. Typical Polish trunk road, narrow, single carriageway, even though it's going to a big city elsewhere, masses of traffic buzzing along it. On my right, there's a high brick wall that just seems to go on and on forever. On the other side of the road, great masses of trees casting the deepest of shade, and quite well-to-do houses set back behind them and behind some grass, so that the people from those houses in some cases are sat outside getting what relief from the heat they can. We continue along that road and it gradually climbs. We leave the houses behind and we eventually get out from the city and the trees altogether. So we're now in what seems to be open country, absolutely baking, still with traffic buzzing along. And then all of a sudden there's a narrow opening in this high brick wall. So turn into there 5 or 6 very steeply pitched steps that are narrow, so they bring me up quite sharply against a huge, forbidding-looking concrete gate, a couple of massive pillars and a lintel on top, crumbling, very old and neglected, and 7-branch candlestick crudely cut into the lintel at the top. So we've got to the new Jewish cemetery. As you go in, the ground continues to rise very steeply, and everywhere is overgrown. Brambles, nettles, piling over each other, circling around each other. It's totally neglected, 8 or 9 feet high, quite forbidding. And the only reason we can get through it is that somebody's roughly cut a path with a scythe to get us through. No sign of tombstones yet, because it was the custom when the Nazis took over any Jewish occupied town that the first thing they did was to destroy the tombstones in the cemeteries. It appears that that was simply because it was the one spiteful thing they could think of that they could still do to those Jews who'd effectively cheated them by dying before they got there. So, climb goes on, and eventually we get out of the weeds. We're higher up than the weeds. And I realise that this cemetery is set on a single-domed huge hill surrounded by perimeter walls in the form of a square, huge distance away. It must be the size of several sports pitches. It's a massive space. And this is my first sight of anything that looks like tombstones. Off to the right, against one of the perimeter walls, it looks like a row of coffin lids have been stacked up. And on closer inspection, these prove to be more or less that. They're in cast concrete. Each of them has a Star of David on it, and some of them have a little plaque put in, presumably by relatives, after the war, that says who used to lie underneath this and where they were murdered. Most of them, it appears, were murdered in either Belzec, which is one of the camps in the region, or Majdanek, a very convenient 3 or 4 miles down the road. Now notice at this point, the sound of the traffic's almost gone. It's back down the other side of the hill. There's all that growth of weed in the way. It's very, very quiet. Looking ahead, down the other side of the hill now, I see that there aren't any weeds there. But peculiarly, there are a lot of small buildings. They look to be no bigger than sheds. They're coloured red and yellow, which is also a bit mysterious. And they just seem to have been scattered. There's no system to this, no paths. It's just a totally neglected, rather forlorn space. And eventually, just wandering around, I find myself in front of one of these buildings. It's no bigger than an old garden shed. I find that the red is some sort of feeble attempted ornamentation. It's red brick, which has been put round the edges of walls, very crudely stuccoed, painted yellow, hence the colours of the things. And on this first one, there are a couple of arches, a rather sad attempt to make it look a bit more ornate, which fails, it doesn't work. But there's a little plaque next to this building, and it says that this marks the grave of 198 Jews, 198, brought out from the ghetto on a particular date in 1942, murdered and buried at that spot. They must be very, very tightly packed. While I'm stood there, my eyes caught by a different formation of graves, some way off, slanting up the hill. These are a little more elaborate because they've been put together from cast concrete bars, roughly arranged in a rectangle, but now beginning to fall apart at the corners so that they look like a row of battered old bedsteads waiting to be collected by a scrapman. And the plaque that I find predictably next to them tells me that these are the graves of, I'm quoting here, Jewish soldiers of the Polish army, murdered in one of the camps. For those of you interested in the technicality, they will have been prisoners of war, by the way. It's at this point that I notice that there's now no sound. The traffic sound's gone, and there's nothing. Not even birdsong. I've never come across this before, haven't since. It's a hot day, I'm in the countryside, there's overgrowth everywhere. No birdsong whatsoever. It's as if, to make the obvious point, the birds are repelled by what there is in this vast field. And as if on cue at that thought, I find myself in front of another one of these little yellow and red buildings. And the plaque next to that tells me that this is the grave of 100 children from the Jewish orphanage who were brought out from Lublin. You know the rest in a particular day, and that's where they are. As I look further down the hill, I see that there are many more of these little yellow and red buildings waiting to be visited. But I realise that I'm not going to do it because this one's the finish for me. Children-filled space just in front of me. They are as close to me as those of you in the second row are now. And it seems to reach out through what's, after all, just 4 or 5 feet of dirt that separate my hand from their hands. right into the brain and it grips it. It is the saddest place that I've ever seen, and I'm sure it will remain that. I feel as though I'm intruding, and though nobody's there, it's totally silent. As I leave, I feel I'm being watched, and to this day I'm sure that I was being. That's my visit to the new Jewish cemetery in Lublin. And if it were possible, logistically it isn't, I would love to know what sort of reactions of any sort, positive or negative, there might be in your minds to this. One of them, I hope, would be anger, and this is where I'm beginning to come back to the point that I started from in the speech. Anger, of course, at the people who did these things and who planned these things, but what I'm trying to suggest is that anger has a bit more of a responsibility than that, and that the anger needs to be a bit more contemporary, that it needs to be directed at those people who are telling us now that the Holocaust didn't happen, or that perhaps it was largely the fault of the victims, or to those people who are setting up the next one by defining minorities and blaming them when things go wrong. Certainly I felt anger, and I felt distress as well, but I've taken care not to get angry or distressed in talking about it to you tonight, and that's for two reasons. Firstly, if I'm ever in an audience being addressed by a speaker who does get angry or distressed, let alone who loses it, I feel very uncomfortable. I think it's the height of bad manners in a speaker to inflict that on their audience. It's self-indulgent, it's a bit vulgar, it actually reduces the impact in my view. And with great respect to our Toastmaster colleague who did give a good speech, my feeling is that she will have made her listeners aware of her own anger, but in doing so diverted them from the more necessary business of perhaps forming reasons to be angry for themselves. The second reason that I've tried to avoid becoming angry or distress myself is that we can't all do it, can we? We can't all turn on anger or distress just because a speech happens to need it or would find it useful. And I don't want anybody who's in that situation to actually feel that in any way they are a second-rank speaker. You're not. This is the message that relates to the title of my speech. In an organisation like Toastmasters, you will often come across advice, good advice, and well-meant advice, certainly from the magazine and often in the clubs as well, from people who will say, this is the best way to achieve such and such an aim, or this is the way you really ought to tackle this sort of issue. And sometimes the recommendation might make you feel slightly uncomfortable, more uncomfortable. What I'm saying to you is, if you find yourself in that position, stick to your instinct. Don't go against it. There is always another way of speaking, never just one. That'll be your way, and it will probably be just as good as anybody else's. The secret, if you want impact for your speeches, of course, as many of you will know, is to be yourself. By all means, if anger is involved, lose it if you think that's going to help. But my message is, on anger, there's a difference in what you achieve by being angry and by conveying anger. And you need not to mix the two up, otherwise you won't be achieving the aim that you set out for. Essentially, to sum up, if when we plan speeches and deliver them, we're honest to ourselves, then I think we will always be honest to the audience, and the audiences will begin to pick that up. And that's the way that you and your speeches will get remembered.